A 10-year-old boy watched his mother's breasts being cut off, and just when people thought he'd survived, they burned him alive. Munich, 1600. Sunlight glared off cobblestones still wet with blood, and screams echoed through narrow streets like a curse that would haunt generations. This is not a legend. It's a true story buried in Europe's darkest history, where justice turned into murder and innocent people were sacrificed to keep the powerful in control. In the shadow of the Counter-Reformation, Bavaria became a laboratory of fanaticism, a place where torture wasn't cruelty, it was policy. Under the rule of Duke Maximilian, entire families could be destroyed because of whispers, rumors, or simply because they were poor. And one family, Paulus, Anna Gumpra, Michelle, and little Hansel Gimpel, became the ultimate victims of evil disguised as law. They were nobodies, a privy cleaner, a grave digger's daughter, 2 unemployed sons, and a 10-year-old boy who still believed the world could be kind. But one lie, one desperate accusation from a condemned thief, turned them into monsters in the eyes of the state. The machinery of persecution roared to life, fueled by confessions extracted under torture, and Munich prepared for one of the most brutal executions in human history. This isn't just the past, it's a warning. Because when fear takes over and the law becomes a weapon, dark secrets can consume entire societies and innocence means nothing. Munich, 1600. A city where church bells rang over streets still slick with blood and the air tasted of fear. In this corner of Europe, the line between faith and fanaticism had vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous power disguised as God's will. The Counter-Reformation had turned Bavaria into a place where suspicion could get you killed, where whispers carried more weight than truth. Where torture wasn't a crime, it was the state's favorite tool for manufacturing guilt. Under Duke Maximilian's iron rule, the law became a weapon wielded not to protect the innocent, but to crush anyone who didn't fit the mold of Catholic orthodoxy. Here, the mere hint of Protestant beliefs was enough to brand you an enemy of the state, a traitor, not just to your country, but to heaven itself. In this world, a single rumor could spiral into a death sentence. And public executions weren't just punishments. They were theater staged for thousands to watch, so everyone would remember what happens to those who dared to step out of line. The streets of Munich became a laboratory of terror. Judges and priests quoted Latin scriptures as they signed death warrants. Screams echoed from underground torture chambers where confessions were ripped from flesh and bone. The Duke's loyal prosecutors hunted for witches, heretics, and scapegoats to prove their devotion and secure their careers. And while the powerful played games with people's lives, the vulnerable, those living on the margins of society, became easy prey. People who cleaned latrines, dug graves, wandered from town to town, or simply dared to exist in poverty. They were the perfect targets for a system that needed enemies to survive, and one family, poor and invisible, would become the perfect victims. Their names were Paulus, Anna Gumpra, Michelle, and Hansel. And soon the entire city would know who they were, though for all the wrong reasons. They were the kind of family no one wanted to notice. People crossed the street to avoid their smell, their tattered clothes, the grime of work nobody else would touch. Paulus Gimpel was 57, his hands cracked and stained from a lifetime as a privy cleaner, a job that meant he spent every day shoveling human waste so that respectable citizens didn't have to smell it. His back bent from carrying other people's filth, but it wasn't the physical pain that weighed him down. It was the way society looked at him as if his very existence was dirty. Anna, his wife, carried her own invisible brand. Her father had been a gravedigger, a man who handled the dead. In a world obsessed with purity and contamination, that meant Anna was marked cursed from birth and kept outside the walls of polite society. Their sons, Gumpre and Michelle, 22 and 20, tried to escape the stain of their family name. But no matter how many towns they drifted through, they couldn't find steady work. They were itinerants, scraping by on odd jobs, harvesting crops one month, cleaning stables the next, never staying anywhere long enough to belong. In Bavaria, wandering people were viewed with suspicion. Criminals in disguise whispered the townsfolk, witches, thieves, spies. And then there was Hansel, only 10 years old, still clutching the last threads of childhood innocence. He didn't understand why strangers spit at his father's feet or why other children weren't allowed to play with him. All he knew was that life was cold and moving from town to town was the only way to survive. They owned almost nothing. Everything they possessed could be stuffed into battered sacks. Their clothes were patched and stained. Their speech marked them as outsiders. And worst of all, they couldn't afford the single most important thing in Bavaria at the dawn of the 17th century: protection. No powerful patron, no wealthy friend to vouch for them. And in an age where faith itself had become a battlefield, being an outsider was enough to get you killed. But the worst was still to come. Because in late 1599, a single desperate lie would ignite the flames of terror that would consume them all and drag them into one of the darkest chapters of Europe's true crime history. It started with a single man standing on the edge of death, a thief shackled and trembling, waiting for the headsman's axe. His crimes were petty stolen goods, empty pockets, but he knew one thing that could save his neck: accusation. In late 1599, he opened his mouth and unleashed a nightmare. Under the flickering torchlight of a Bavarian prison, he whispered names Gumpre and Michel Gimpel. He claimed they had murdered pregnant women, ripped infants from wombs, and spilled blood in secret midnight rituals. It was the perfect story. Because in the twisted logic of the time, murdering a pregnant woman wasn't just murder, it was witchcraft, it was Satan's work. It meant dark spells, infant sacrifice, a conspiracy to tear down God's order. The thief gave details no one could verify. Had he ever met the Gimpel brothers? No one knew. Or did he just choose two faces from the crowd of outcasts he'd seen begging for work? No one cared. Because in Bavaria, a rumor like that was a spark falling into a field of dry straw. Within days, the machinery of persecution roared to life. Orders flew from courtrooms to sheriffs, from priests to bailiffs. Find the Gimpel family, arrest them, bring them to Munich for the Duke's personal attention. Because if there was anything Duke Maximilian loved more than his iron Catholic faith, it was a public demonstration of power. And here was the perfect case: a family of nobodies accused of the ultimate evil. The stage was set for the perfect show trial. In the taverns, whispers slithered like snakes. They're witches. They kill unborn babies. They serve the devil. People who had never spoken to the Gimpel family suddenly claimed they'd seen dark shapes moving under the moon, heard chanting from the woods, felt chills crawl down their spines. And all the while, Paulus, Anna Gumpre, Michel, and young Hansel continued moving from town to town, unaware that their names were now poison. That strangers they'd never met were calling for their deaths. Because in a world ruled by fear and superstition, the truth didn't matter. Only the accusation did. And soon, under the cloak of a winter night, soldiers would come for them, turning their wandering life into a trap from which there was no escape. Winter's breath bit into the stones of Altmanstein as February fell like a silent predator. Snow piled high outside the inn where the Gimpel family slept, huddled under thin blankets, dreaming only of a few more coins and a town where no one spat at their feet. They didn't know the nightmare was already marching toward them on booted feet. The soldiers came in darkness, no warning, no mercy. Steel slammed against wooden doors. Torches cast monstrous shadows on the walls as the soldiers flooded the small room. The screams of Anna and her son split the night while Paulus tried to shield them with a body already worn and broken from years of back-breaking work. They dragged the adults from their beds, Anna in a thin nightgown, barefoot on freezing floors. Gumpre and Michel half-dressed, blinking away sleep and terror. Chains snapped shut around their wrists. Outside, snow fell silently, as if trying to bury the horror unfolding beneath it. At first, Hansel was left behind. Just 10 years old, clutching a dirty blanket, his wide eyes reflecting the torchlight. He stared at the landlord, silently pleading for an answer. The landlord didn't know what to do. No one did. Because what do you do when the Duke's soldiers rip a family from their beds? So the landlord, shaking, brought Hansel to the jail himself. And that was how a child walked unknowingly into the jaws of the same trap that had swallowed his family. From the cold cells of Altmanstein, the Gimpel family was transferred to Munich. No ordinary prison awaited them. The Falcon Tower loomed above the city, a fortress and a dungeon rolled into one. Its thick walls were said to be soaked with the screams of men and women whose bodies broke under devices designed by people who believed torture could save souls. Because the Duke didn't want this to be handled by local judges, he wanted a spectacle, a demonstration, a chance to show Bavaria and God that he could crush heresy and sin with iron fists. And waiting inside the Falcon Tower was a man who would become the architect of the Gimpel family's destruction, Jan Sigismund Wagner. An educated prosecutor, a devout Catholic, and a man who believed the road to heaven was paved in blood. And soon, under his orders, the Gimpel family would discover that, in Munich, truth wasn't extracted by words, it was ripped from flesh and bone. Inside Munich's Falcon Tower, daylight never reached the stone corridors. Shadows clung to damp walls, and the air smelled of rust mold and old blood. Jan Sigismund Wagner stood at the center of it all, a man in crisp black robes, eyes cold as winter. He believed he was saving souls, even if it meant tearing flesh from bone. He didn't see the Gimpel family as human beings. To him, they were heretics, threats to the Holy Order, and the only way to purge their sins was to make them confess, even if those confessions were carved out of agony. The Falcon Tower wasn't merely a prison. It was a machine designed to break bodies and minds. They started with Paulus, strappato, his hands tied behind his back, lifted off the ground by a rope twisted around his wrists. The joints in his shoulders screamed as they tore apart. Wagner asked gentle questions about witches, Satan conspiracies, but every silence earned Paulus another drop from the ropes. His feet barely brushed the stone floor as he begged God for mercy. Then came the red-hot pincers, heated until they glowed orange. They pressed them against Paulus's chest, his arms, his thighs. Each touch left blackened craters in his skin, the air filled with a smell halfway between burning meat and charred leather. Anna's turn followed. They stripped her naked. They focused on her breasts, because in the twisted minds of her interrogators, that was proof of womanly corruption, a link to witchcraft and infanticide. They used glowing metal to tear flesh while priests watched and murmured prayers convinced they were driving out the devil. And all the while, Gumpry and Michelle were forced to watch. Every scream from their parents was a blade slicing into their own resolve. When their turn came, they endured the rack, each click of the windlass stretching their joints toward the point of snapping. Thumbs crushed in iron screws, throats choking on gallons of forced water until panic robbed them of air. But the most insidious torture wasn't metal or fire, it was Hansel. Barely 10 eyes wide, forced to watch. Guards told him he could save his parents if he just confessed that they worshipped Satan, that they killed babies. Eventually, every one of them broke. They confessed to murders they never committed, to witchcraft they'd never practiced, to a conspiracy that existed only in Wagner's mind. Names spilled from trembling lips, names of friends, strangers, even people who didn't exist. Because under that much pain, truth is whatever stops the screaming. By the end, over 400 people were implicated in the plot, proving nothing except how easy it is to create monsters out of thin air. And for Duke Maximilian, it was perfect. He had his evidence. Now it was time for the final act, a public execution so brutal it would freeze Bavaria in fear for decades to come. July 29th, 1600. Munich woke up to the promise of a show. Church bells tolled across the city as thousands poured into the main square. Merchants set up stalls selling roasted meat bread and ale. Children climbed onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view. To the authorities, this wasn't a crime scene. It was entertainment. A spectacle, a warning. A wooden scaffold rose high above the crowd. Sunlight glinted off iron chains and red-hot pincers heating over roaring fires. The stench of burning pitch mixed with the tang of sweat and anticipation. People jostled for space, eager to see the condemned. The Gimpel family was dragged into the square in chains. Their clothes hung in bloody shreds. Anna's eyes were vacant, as if the woman inside her had already died days ago. Paulus stumbled half-conscious, his shirt sticking to seeping burns across his chest. Gumpry and Michelle shuffled forward, bodies shaking, faces twisted in silent horror. And then there was Hansel, just 10 years old. forced to stand on the scaffold so he could watch everything. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Look how they're thumping my father's arms, and my mother is squirming." The executioner began with Paulus. They stripped him naked, laid him across a wooden block. With surgical precision, they used red-hot pincers to tear chunks of flesh from his arms, legs, and chest. Each burn left black holes in his skin. Blood steamed in the summer air. Yet they kept him alive, carefully avoiding vital organs. This was not just punishment, it was theater. Anna's torture came next. Because she was a woman and accused of witchcraft, her punishment had to be symbolic. They sliced off her breasts and smeared the blood onto the lips of her two sons as if to cleanse them of maternal corruption. The crowd gasped. Some women wept, but no one dared to intervene. Gumpre and Michelle were tortured in turn, forced to watch their parents' destruction. The final blow came as Paulus, barely clinging to life, was impaled alive. A sharpened stake driven through his body and raised upright so he hung twitching in the summer sun. For hours the square vibrated with the sounds of screaming. Sermons blared from church pulpits declaring this slaughter to be holy justice. And all the while little Hansel remained standing on that scaffold, eyes red, knees shaking. The Duke's men whispered that sparing the boy would prove the mercy of the church. But mercy was the one thing Munich had none of that day. And soon, Hansel would learn that surviving the spectacle didn't mean escaping the executioner's blade. When the blood dried on Munich's cobblestones and the crowds finally scattered, Hansel Gimple remained alive. But he was a child carrying scars deeper than any burn. He had watched his father ripped apart piece by piece. He had seen his mother's blood smeared across his brother's lips. He had smelled the stench of searing flesh while priests called it holy justice. People whispered that sparing the boy was an act of mercy, that perhaps the church would take him in, raise him to be a good Catholic, cleanse him of his family's sins. But mercy was a lie Munich told itself. Because for weeks after the execution, Hansel sat in a cell beneath the Falcon Tower. The walls wept with moisture. Chains rattled in the darkness. Guards came to him every day demanding he confess again, that he name more names, that he remember secret meetings under moonlight, witches flying on broomsticks, demons dancing in the forest. Hansel was 10. He didn't even know how to spell the word heresy. But he had learned one thing in Munich: truth was whatever stopped the pain. So he spoke. He gave them names. Names of people who didn't exist. Names of strangers he'd glimpsed once in a marketplace. Names pulled from nightmares. Because he thought maybe if he told them what they wanted to hear, he could go home. But there was no home to go back to. His family was gone, their bodies turned to ash and bone fragments. The crowd had devoured their suffering like a festival. And now the same city that once promised to save Hansel decided that his blood too needed to be spilled. On November 26, 1600, Hansel Gimple was led out from his cell. No grand stage this time. No cheering crowds. Just a handful of soldiers, a stake, and a pit of coals glowing like hungry eyes in the winter gloom. They tied his small hands. They whispered prayers. And then they burned him alive. He screamed for his mother. He begged them to stop. But the fire swallowed his voice. The flames were supposed to purify his soul, but all they did was silence a child who had already suffered more than any 10-year-old should ever endure. And even in his final moments, Hansel was forced to confess again. His voice shaking, he named more conspirators. Because the machine that had devoured his family demanded to keep feeding. But what Bavaria didn't expect was how Hansel's death would echo far beyond Munich. Because the story of the Gimple family would become one of the darkest secrets history tried to bury, and a lesson that still haunts us today. 4 centuries have passed since flames swallowed Hansel Gimple's screams, but the shadows of the Falcon Tower still stretch across history. Because what happened in Munich in 1600 wasn't just a tragedy for one family. It was a blueprint for how power can twist the law into murder and how fear can turn entire societies into accomplices. The Gimple family wasn't guilty. Modern historians have pored over the dusty court records, the torture logs, the priests' sermons, and they found no real evidence. The confessions were nothing but words torn from battered bodies. Lies whispered through cracked lips because pain makes the truth irrelevant. Yet for centuries the official story held. People believed the Gimple family were witches, baby killers, Satan's disciples. Why? Because the state needed scapegoats, and the crowd needed blood to distract them from famine, poverty, and political chaos. And this is why the Gimple story still matters. Because what Munich proved is chillingly simple: the law can become a weapon, and ordinary people can become executioners. It's easy to look back and say, that was the past. We're better now. But are we? Even today in the 21st century, people are tortured into confessions. Whole communities get branded as threats because of how they look, what they believe, or where they come from. Crowds still gather, maybe not in public squares, but online, hungry for someone to blame. The same machinery that destroyed the Gimple family hasn't vanished. It's only changed shape. It wears new uniforms, uses new technology, and hides behind new words like national security, fake news, or public safety. And that's why we need to remember Hansel's small, shaking voice, his whispered words, "Look how they're thumping my father's arms." Because his story is a dark warning. Once the machinery of persecution starts turning, it doesn't stop for truth. It doesn't stop for innocence. It doesn't even stop for children. The real horror of Munich wasn't just the torture chambers or the burning stake. It was that ordinary judges, priests, soldiers, and neighbors all played a part and convinced themselves they were serving justice. So the question we're left with isn't just what happened to the Gimple family. It's whether we're brave enough to stop it from happening again. Because the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we want to believe. And history has shown again and again how fast the law can become the sharpest blade of all. So next time you hear someone say it could never happen here, remember Hansel Gimple, remember the screams buried beneath the Falcon Tower, because the real danger isn't just torture chambers or burning stakes, it's how easily we look away. If this story made you feel something, anger, sadness, fear, that's because deep down you know it could happen again. And stories like this deserve to be told so we never forget how fragile justice truly is. Drop a comment below. Tell me, do you think we've learned enough from history to stop it repeating? And if you want more dark history and true stories they tried to hide, hit like, save this video and subscribe right now. Because the past is still alive and it's waiting for us to pay attention.